Hi, my name is Emiel Ramakers and this is a session on the Oracle Database Service for Azure, or ODSA. This is the second in a four-part series, and in this session we'll have a look more at the service architecture of ODSA and some of the components that it creates. So first of all, we'll start with a bit of an introduction to Azure, some of the naming in Azure that might be a little bit different from OCI, which will be important to understand when we talk about the various components that the ODSA service creates. Then we'll have a look at exactly that. What does the ODSA service create in the customer's tenancies, and also what does it look like a little bit internally. I won't be showing all of the details, but where it is important, where it interfaces with what customers can see, it's important that we understand that. And then I'll give a demo, or actually just a look at those items both in Azure and in OCI. We'll go and have a look at what gets created when you create a database and when you set up the service itself, when you do your account linking. As mentioned, this is the second in a four-part series. So in the previous session we had a look at some of the introduction topics on ODSA, and in the next two sessions we'll also look at some advanced networking, specifically how to plug into a hub and spoke network on the Azure side, and also we'll have a look at disaster recovery and high availability options for ODSA. But let's start now with looking at a little bit of a deep dive into the ODSA architecture. So let's start at looking at some of the terminology in Azure. So in Azure we have VNets, we have Express Route when the OCI equivalent is Fast Connect. We have Virtual Network Gateway, which it's not quite the same as a DRG, but is at least used to open up a VNet to talk to other things. We have route tables, of course, and then we have network security groups, but we don't have things like OCI security lists. We only have network security groups in Azure. It's useful to understand this when we talk about ODSA and what type of resources in Azure it's using. The other thing that is useful to understand is some of the hierarchy in Azure. So in Azure we use subscriptions. The best way to think about that is the Azure equivalent of what in OCI is a child tenancy. But the difference is that many enterprise customers in Azure often have very many subscriptions, and that is not so common in OCI with child tenancies. So it's quite normal to have many subscriptions to basically put different types of applications in a different subscription. But then within a subscription we have resource groups, and those resource groups are a flat structure. So where in OCI we have compartments, and that is the best way to compare the resource groups with. Those compartments in OCI can of course be nested. You can have a subcompartment and a subcompartment and a subcompartment. That is not possible with resource groups in Azure. So because ODSA uses Azure terminology like subscriptions and resource groups, it is important to understand how that gets reflected in OCI, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. So when it comes to what sort of stuff gets created, it is also important to think a little bit about what ODSA actually does. So there are these three times when we need to think about in the life of ODSA. There is the very first setup, when the initial stuff gets created, the initial handshake is done, all of the account setup. Then there is the creation of the database or databases. There's a whole bunch of stuff that gets created then. And then in the day-to-day life of the database, we send metrics and events over and all of that sort of stuff. And we have things for that as well to go and have a look at. So let's go and have a look at some of those things. We're going to have a look at what gets created when you do the account linking, and then what gets created when you create a database. So when it comes to account linking, the thing that gets created first is this Azure Enterprise application, which is specifically for the Oracle Database service. And that also integrates with the roles and privileges and all of that sort of stuff in Azure. It's actually through that enterprise application that you can set your roles and privileges for the users of ODSA. So who gets to create databases, etc. During the account linking, you can also have a look at single sign-on, where you can set that up, and the first compartment structure gets created. So let's go and have a look to see what that actually looks like in Azure. So here I am in Azure, and if I go to Enterprise Applications within Azure, I can see I've got a bunch of those here, and one of them is the Oracle Database Service. So this gets created in that very first account linking phase. And within this enterprise application, I can see the section on users and groups. Here I can see the users and groups that have been assigned to this enterprise application, and therefore the members of these groups, in this case they are all groups, the members of this group have been given particular roles. So you can do the role assignment through this application, and these roles are specific to ODSA, and they are provided through this application only. So you can, for example, give somebody the ODSA database family administrator privilege, let's say, or network link administrator, or XDB administrator, etc., all of the roles that are here. So in this particular case, this group and the next groups have been assigned all of these roles, but you can also think of situations where certain people in certain groups are only assigned a subset of roles because they only need to be available maybe to look at the databases and not create new databases. So that is how you do your role-based access for ODSA. Then what we also see within the enterprise applications is the single sign-on application, where the SAML provider is created automatically if you let it to enable the single sign-on to OCI within Azure user. So this gets created and set up all automatically if you let the ODSA database, so if you let ODSA do that. If we then go and have a look at those databases on the OCI side, you will see that within domains here, the users are automatically populated here. If you let it do that, we have an application that is set up with the Azure client, and we have various things that set up to support the single sign-on here. So if we then start to have a look at what gets created when you create a database. So when you create a database, first of all, the network link is created, as we call it. So the network link consists of a number of ODSA components that exist in the ODSA service, but also of some OCI components. So you need to think of, for example, the VCN and a DRG, and all of the various routing rules, etc. And then also there is some peering done from the ODSA components to the Azure VNet that you selected. And of course, the database service is created and the metrics are created. So let's have a closer look at that for a second. So this is a picture that everybody will hopefully be familiar with. This is a normal ODSA picture with the VNet, with your application on the left-hand side in your Azure, and then ODSA, magic box, and the database on the right side in the VCN that has been created by ODSA. Now, if we lift up a little bit of that magic box, then the first thing that we need to realize is that that ODSA control plane actually exists partially in Azure and partially in OCI. It's not in the customer's tenancy or in the customer subscription. It is in the ODSA service subscription and tenancy, but it does exist in OCI and in Azure both, and is linked to the customer's environment from there. And then if we look just a little bit closer, and this will be important to understand later, the first thing on the Azure side that your VNet will connect to is a VNet that gets especially created for every database that gets created, an ODSA VNet, which is paired with the customer's VNet. And within that, there is a ODSA router. And that router basically takes the traffic and puts it to other ODSA components, which we won't quite show here, and ultimately over the interconnect to OCI, and from there then over to the customer visible VCN. And the database service inside that. So it is important to understand that, because when we look at what we can see in Azure, some of this we can actually see, so then we can understand where that fits. So let's go and have a look at our Azure environment and see what we can actually see there. So if we go back to the main screen and we first of all go to virtual networks, we can have a look at, for example, this virtual network, which has some databases attached to it. We can see that through peerings. So when we select peerings, we see these 3 peers. So these are 3 peerings to 3 ODSA VNets that get created. As I mentioned, every time that you create a new database in ODSA, we basically get a VNet created within the ODSA realm, and that gets paired with this VNet, with the VNet that you select. So if you want to go and have a look at those VNets, of course you can't see those, because they don't exist in the customer's environment. They exist in the ODSA environment, which you don't have any rights to. So you can only see the peering, but you can't see any further. You can see a little bit further though. If you go into ODSA and you go, I'm already here in this particular database that is against that VNet that I just showed. In this environment, if I select database system, and then in database system I select networking, I can see some essentials here, and part of that is this router IP address. So that will be important. In one of the other sessions we will look at hub and spoke networking. That's actually when we really need this. But it is important to understand that you can see that here, and with the picture that I showed you earlier, you can put that in context of, okay, this is the first place that out of the VNet my database traffic will travel to, and from there it is then by ODSA routed through a bunch of other stuff and over the interconnect towards OCI. But this is the first place that it lands. If we look at OCI in this context, we can have a look at the networking, for example, virtual cloud networks. And here we can see a whole bunch of virtual cloud networks that were created by ODSA. One thing that is important that I didn't mention earlier, the compartment structure. So part of this is created when the initial linking is done, and part of it is created maybe a little bit later on, depending on what is used. But structure-wise, what you can see is this first cloud link, then an ID for the particular subscription, and underneath those subscriptions you have subcompartments for each resource group. So I'm using the Emiel demo resource group here, so you can see that that goes from the cloud link to the subscription to the resource group name, all represented within OCI as just subcompartments. And so that's how you can link those back to the structure on Azure. So here we can see a whole bunch of VCNs. I won't go and guess which one I'm actually using. I will go to database, and within the database I can see the database I was using earlier, this one, and I can see all of this information here as well, and I can link to the VCN here. So all of that stuff gets created by ODSA when you create a database. There's a DRG that gets created, etc. You can see all of that, but again, just like on the Azure side, from the DRG, the trail runs cold, because the DRG is then connected to stuff within the ODSA framework and that you can no longer see. So then lastly, let's also just reiterate, if I go back to this database, also on database creation, you get these dashboards and metrics. So when you hit dashboard, you go out to Azure, the actual Azure portal, and this dashboards gets created during database creation. Is another artifact that gets created during that process and gets populated with things like the connection to the database, etc. And these graphs that nicely show various performance metrics. You can also click on metrics itself, which also gets you into Azure, of course, and you can have a closer look at those metrics. So this OCI database custom metric namespace gets created, with these various metrics that you can use. And you can have a look at those metrics there. So that, in short, is a bit of an overview of the sort of stuff that gets created when you start to use ODSA. So during the account linking, the important thing is the enterprise application. That's the thing that you will go back to set up your roles and privileges for the various groups that you want to have access to these ODSA databases. If you want single sign-on to OCI, you can do that from there as well. There's another enterprise application there, as we've seen, and some of the compartment structure that we've looked at also gets created when the account linking is done. Then when it comes to database creation, we've seen a lot of components, right? We see all the stuff on OCI, the VCNs, and the actual databases, of course, but also the DRG. We have had a quick look under the covers to have a look at some of the ODSA components that get created, and especially how that is linked to your Azure VNet that you connect from. And then also we had a look at the metrics that get created. So hopefully that was useful. You have a bit of an understanding of what gets created as part of ODSA and what fits where in the context of the whole thing. Thank you very much.